Here's a number that explains everything about Spirit Airlines, and it has nothing to do with $9 airfare. In 2024, nearly 59 cents of every dollar Spirit made came from bag fees, seat fees, and add-ons, not the ticket. The ticket was basically bait. Spirit wasn't really an airline that sold seats. It was a fee collection company that happened to own some planes. And here's the crazy part. That model worked. It was, by the numbers, one of the most successful ancillary revenue engines in the entire industry. And it still wasn't enough. After 34 years in the air, Spirit Airlines shut down completely. Every flight canceled, every yellow plane grounded. The company that solved the revenue puzzle went out of business anyway. So the real question isn't why did a cheap airline struggle? It's how does a business that figured out the money model still end up getting liquidated? That's what I want to dig into. Let's look at the actual bleeding because it happened in layers, not all at once. Layer 1, the losses. Spirit lost roughly $2.5 billion between 2020 and 2024. Then in 25 alone, one single year, it lost another $2.7 billion. That's not a company having a rough quarter. That's a company hemorrhaging faster than it can restructure. Layer 2, the fleet. Spirit's growth over the past several years leaned heavily on a new generation of Airbus jets powered by Pratt & Whitney's geared turbofan engine. That engine had a documented defect requiring extended teardown inspections, and because Spirit had bet so much of its expansion on exactly that engine family, it got hit harder than almost any other airline in the country. Planes it needed to fly simply couldn't fly. Layer 3, Spirit filed for bankruptcy twice in less than a year. Once in November 2024 and again in August of 2025, 5 months after it thought it had already fixed itself. A number to remember, 2 bankruptcies 11 months apart. That's not a company in a downturn. That's a company that never found the floor. It's a fourth layer in the situation, and it's one people go to the most. JetBlue merger. Spirit had a deal to be acquired for $3.8 billion, which would have handled a lot of the balance sheet. Federal regulators sued to block it, arguing it would remove the largest ultra low-cost rival from the market and hurt budget-conscious travelers. A federal judge agreed, and the deal died in early 2024. Spirit was left to fix a fragile airline entirely on its own, right as the engine problem and the losses were both accelerating. And I know you've seen the memes. You booked a $9 flight, and by the time you added a seat assignment and a checked bag, you paid more than you would on a normal airline. That's not an accident. That's the entire design. But it stopped being a clever trick and started being a trap. A checked bag at the counter climbed as high as $90. The cheap airline became the airline where nothing was actually cheap once you needed anything at all. And then the ending made all of that worse. When Spirit finally shut down, it didn't wind down gracefully over a season of advance notice. It canceled everything immediately, leaving passengers stranded mid-trip with tickets that were suddenly worthless. Other airlines had to step in and cap emergency one-way fares around $200 just to get people home. Employees had spent years building a career at the company, found out their airline just didn't exist anymore. That's the human version of the collapse, a budget promise that turned into a bind, an ending that gave nobody time to prepare. Think about what that actually means on the ground. Someone books a flight to a wedding or a funeral or that one vacation they saved for all year, and he finds out the morning of that the airline simply doesn't exist anymore. There's no rebooking desk because there's no airline behind the desk. And on the employee side, this wasn't a slow layoff with severance packages and long notice periods. It was thousands of people who showed up expecting a paycheck and a schedule and instead got the news that their company had ceased to operate. Other airlines offered preferential hiring to Spirit's former staff, which is kind of a gesture, but it doesn't really erase the fact that the entire workforce lost their employer overnight. Now, before I get into my strategy and what I would have done, I've told you the problems that Spirit had. How would you have handled this, right? You've seen the whole picture. You've seen the revenue engine fail, the engine defect grounded a lot of the planes, the bankruptcies, the stranded passengers. If you were the sitting CEO, how would you have handled this? Let me know in the comments down below. Move 1 would have been to take the deal from Frontier. Back in 2022, Frontier had a deal on the table to merge with Spirit, a same size all-stock combination of 2 ultra low cost carriers. But that was when JetBlue jumped in with a bigger, flashier, higher dollar offer, and that's what Spirit took. That decision looked smart on the spreadsheet, but it turned out to be fatal in the courtroom. Regulators sued to block the JetBlue deal specifically because it would have removed the ultra low cost rival from the market entirely, and a federal judge agreed and blocked it. A Frontier to Spirit merger, 2 similarly sized budget carriers combining, was never going to draw that same argument. I'd have taken that deal that could actually actually really survive a review. Now, move number 2 would never let one engine supplier become your whole growth plan. I think this is true in like e-commerce businesses too. Having just one supplier and not a backup supplier is crazy, because Spirit's expansion was disproportionately tied to jets running on that Pratt & Whitney engine I mentioned. When that engine had problems, Spirit didn't have a fallback plan. I would have kept a deliberate buffer of older, already proven aircraft, and a mix of it too, specifically to avoid that one manufacturer bad year campaign. I think if you're going to have an airline, you have to diversify your fleet so that you can never get caught in the trap. The same way, if I had a specific manufacturer making me shirts or whatever it is, I'm going to have 2 or 3 of those lined up, not just one, because if one goes out of business, I'm done. My third move would be to move up market before you have to. The entire Spirit playbook really was dependent on being the cheap airline that was stripped down to the bottom. And once the big legacy carriers started bringing down their basic economy tiers, that gap closed. And Spirit was competing on price against companies that they just couldn't beat. Other budget carriers saw this coming and started layering other premium options into their lineups. Extra legroom seating, bundled fare tiers, loyalty partnerships that gave frequent flyers a reason to stay instead of price shopping every trip. New entrants into the same budget space have built a hybrid model from day one. Things like the premium seating, comfort tier, and it's still alongside the rock bottom option. So there's a second business inside the business if the bottom tier gets squeezed. I'd have built that premium lane years before I needed it, not scrambling to bolt one thing on in a falling ship. Okay, let's talk math. Here's the one number that actually proved the restructuring thesis wasn't crazy. In its first bankruptcy, Spirit cut its debt and lease obligations from $7.4 billion down to $2 billion. On paper, that's a real fix. But the problem wasn't the math. The math worked. What broke it was everything happening outside the spreadsheet. A fuel cost spike, a rescue deal that fell apart over how much equity the government would end up owning, and a fleet that still couldn't fly at full capacity. The restructuring solved the debt, but it never solved the operation. To put it another way, imagine paying off your mortgage and then losing your job in the same month. The balance sheet fix was real. It just wasn't the thing that actually was going to kill you. So let me be real here. This collapse has so many independent causes stacking on top of each other that it would have been almost impossible to save this company. Any of the 3 moves would have been okay, but you had to do all of them together, right? For example, the merger. If you take away the engine problem alone, it might have still crippled the fleet. If you fix the engine exposure and the fuel spike still hits every airline, it's not just Spirit. What do you do about that? There's also a piece of this is genuinely a live political argument, and I'm gonna lay it out plainly and not take a side. The merger that got blocked happened under one administration's Justice Department on antitrust grounds. The rescue deal that later fell apart happened under the next administration over how much of the company the government would control in exchange for cash. Reasonable people disagree about how much blame belongs to either decision versus the engine defect and the fuel spikes that were happening regardless of who was in office. I'm not going to pretend that there's a clear single villain here. There is not. What I do believe is this: a company running on a single engine supplier, a single narrow identity, and no real fallback plan was fragile long before any of the headlines hit. My moves don't guarantee survival. They removed some of the fragility that made every other blow so much harder to absorb. Spirit Airlines solved the revenue problem and still went out of business, because a business that's fragile in every other way can't survive a clever pricing model alone. So now that you see the different problems they had, the different issues, and how it all happened, how would you have saved this business? I'm curious to hear from y'all down in the comments below. If you watched to this point, I appreciate you. Thank you for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe.